handed it out. So thank you all for being here this evening with me here at the Woodford County Extension Office, you at home in your pajamas and your comfy clothes, tonight to talk about boiling water canning. A lot of the things we're going to talk about in this program have to do with canning, period, but tonight we are focusing on boiling water. So I am Elizabeth Coots, and I am the Family and Consumer Sciences Agent at the Woodford County Extension Office. If you're not familiar with the Extension Service, we are a branch of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food, and Environment. There's an Extension office in every county in Kentucky, and we are on the county level providing education and resources for the people of our community. So one of the areas in my program area of Family and Consumer Sciences is canning and food preservation. So that is what this series is all about, mostly canning, but of course we have a dehydrating class in there. And I hope that you can join for some of the other classes or some of the other videos if you're watching this as a recording. So if you have just come in, if you would please put your name in the chat and where you're watching from, just your county, wherever you're joining us from. That will help us keep track of who is here. And I mentioned, I think that I will email the recording link out after this presentation. So even for those who didn't make it tonight, they can watch the recording. I will also be talking about some resources throughout this presentation tonight, and I will have a list of those resources to share with you. And like I said, if you have any questions as we go throughout, just put those in the chat box. We'll use that feature as opposed to unmuting and speaking, just for ease of the presentation. And then Ruby will let me know if it's pertinent to what we're talking about at the time or to save till the end. So we are going to go ahead and get started in talking about boiling water canning. And I have a PowerPoint that we're gonna share, and then I have a couple of videos, and then I'm going to be showing some things here that I have tonight. So the purpose of this class and the purpose of teaching canning classes really is to not only teach you how to can, but also to teach you why there are certain ways that you can, why there's certain equipment that we want to use, and why there's certain recipes and methods that you want to follow. So one thing that I want to ask you to get started, and you can just type this in the chat, just informal. I'm always curious to know, what is your experience with canning? A lot of people say either I've never done it before, or, well, I remember my mom or grandma doing it in the kitchen when we were growing up, or maybe you dabbled in it a little yourself. I've also had people come to my classes who are experienced, and they said, I've been canning for decades, but I'm just curious to know if, maybe things have changed or if there's something new to learn, tips and tricks. So I welcome everybody in all of those experience levels to this class. So after you put that in, I'm also curious to know, why would you want to can your own food? And I'll just share, for me, the reason that I want to can my own food is mostly because I can control what goes in that food. So if I buy something at the store, I might have to turn it around and read the ingredients on it. But if I can it myself, if I preserve it myself, I know exactly what is in that jar because I put it there. So a couple other reasons why you might want to can your own is to preserve your harvest. If you grow a garden and you want to have green beans in January, the canning is a great way to do that. And of course, you don't have to keep it in your refrigerator or freezer. It can stay out at room temperature. You can save money by canning, and that can kind of go either way. You could argue that fact. Do you really save money? It's probably one of those things that the more you can, the more you put into it, the more savings you're going to see. But you can certainly save money by canning. Definitely better tasting food. If you have ever had, like I mentioned, green beans that were home canned in the middle of January, it tastes like you're eating your garden. It is a nice treat in the middle of winter. And also to continue family traditions and a sense of satisfaction. We were talking before we started the class tonight that there is nothing like the sound of your jars popping. You hear them seal and you think, yes, finished, sense of satisfaction. I did it. I canned this food. So there's definitely different reasons why people can. And it looks like quite a variety of reasons too. So for tonight, what I want you to gain from this program, I want you to be able to identify research-based methods. I want you to understand a little bit about the acid level in foods and what type of canner we use based on different acid level in foods. Identify what foods can be canned in a boiling water canner, and then learn the step-by-step process of boiling water canner, which we're going to go through. So Ruby, if you would share the PowerPoint, and we will go ahead and go to slide 5. And while she's doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and start. But I mentioned research-based methods. And that is one thing that with the Extension Service, that we want you to use research-based methods, not just because it's our way, but because it is literally research-based. When we think about canning, and if we were in person, I would ask you, why do you think people might be afraid of canning, or what is a potential concern? And of course, food spoilage. A lot of people will say the pressure canner exploding, but that really is not a concern with modern equipment nowadays. There's lots of safety features. But the biggest one is food poisoning and botulism. That's the one that a lot of people will comment. And that's true. That certainly can be a cause for concern. That is really one of the big reasons why we are promoting these research-based methods and research-based recipes, is so that we can prevent any type of foodborne illness. And botulism is by far the worst illness that can come from improperly canned foods. So we want to prevent that. So like I said, research-based methods and research-based recipes. So if we can something that is improper, of course, your food could spoil, the quality could be low, it could have an off color or texture. Some of those things you can look at or smell it and you know that, ooh, that doesn't smell right or look right, I'm not going to eat it. But there's other things that can be in an improperly canned jar of food that could cause more of a danger. So again, we just go back to what is research-based, and we'll talk a little more about research-based methods and recipes in a little bit. So there are currently 2 research-based methods that are approved and acceptable for home canning, and it is boiling water, which we're talking about tonight, of course, and pressure canning, which we'll be talking about in a few sessions. So anything that is home canned has to be canned in one of those 2 methods. It depends on the type of food and the recipe and the acid level, which we'll talk about as well. There's lots of information out there. Of course, we are in the age of information, but there's information out there about canning in the oven and the microwave, and open kettle canning, which is just boiling your jars for a very long time, or also in the electric pressure cooker. Name brand is the Instant Pot. And all of those methods are basically not safe to use because they have not been tested. Some of them have, and they have been deemed very unsafe, but those are not safe to use. If you're home canning, the only things that you want to use is the boiling water canner and the pressure canner. I like to think of, when it comes to canning, whether boiling water or pressure, it takes a little bit of energy to can, takes a little bit of equipment, takes a little bit of knowledge and skill, to be able to understand how to do this. And it takes a little bit of time preparing the recipe, and if you have a garden, planting that garden, picking the produce, all of those steps, that's a lot that goes into this little jar of salsa. And by golly, if I'm going to put blood, sweat, and tears into this delicious jar of salsa, I not only want it to taste good and be a good quality, but I want it to be safe. So I am going to go about this the safest way that I can. And that's one reason why I like to say, the safest of the safe, and you'll get the best of the best quality. It's worth putting your time and energy into the right way. Okay, so when we're talking about boiling water canner, or boiling water canning, There are certain things that can be canned in the boiling water canner, and they are, as you see on your side, jams and jellies, marmalades, preserves, conserves, any type of fresh fruit, tomatoes and tomato products, which of course also includes salsa, and pickled and fermented foods. And of course, when you think pickles, you think cucumbers, but anything that's pickled or fermented can be safely canned in the boiling water canner. All of these foods are high acid, and we'll talk about that a little more. But again, research-based methods, and this slide is kind of a repeat of what I've said before as far as the research-based methods, but you'll hear me say that a lot. That's kind of, like on the test, oh, you'll hear me say this a lot. Put a star by it. This is a very important aspect. So I want you to understand this concept, and especially when you are looking for recipes to can. So with research-based methods, you want to make sure that you're not modifying the recipe. Okay, so if you had a recipe for strawberry jam and it just tasted a little too sweet and you decided to back off the sugar, that's not recommended. If you wanted to back off the sugar because it was a little too sweet, you could try to find another recipe. For jam in particular, you could use a low or reduced sugar pectin. You could call me at the Woodford County Extension Office and I would be glad to help find a recipe for you. You could also call your local extension agent if you're not in Woodford County, and they can help you find a recipe that might work better suited to your taste. But don't change the recipe, don't change the processing time or the processing method. So if you have a recipe for, let's say, green beans have to be canned in the pressure canner. There is no conversion of time to can those green beans in the boiling water canner. Okay, so the method, the time, and the recipe, we don't want to mess around with that. And then open kettle canning, I mentioned that earlier. That is actually an old method of just putting your sealed jar down in boiling water and boiling it 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 for hours, and then it seals, which it does seal, but we'll talk about why that is not appropriate for things like green beans. Okay, so I want to share with you some resources. So I'm talking about these methods and these recipes, and you're like, Elizabeth, how do I know? I just have my grandmother's recipes that have been passed down. Well, there are lots of resources. So I'm going to show you and talk about these really quickly, and I will send you the list of resources. Now, I hope you have the resources that either I printed for you or that I emailed, and maybe you haven't picked them up from the extension office yet, but we have these available if you would like. We're not mailing these because it is so much, but if you want these printed, you can come by the extension office and get a packet of those. These are all of our food preservation publications with the University of Kentucky Extension Service. And you'll see there are lots there. There may even be some there that looks new to you, like, oh, I didn't realize that. So I hope that you will use those resources and keep those. Tonight, though, and I'll go ahead and mention this now, the publication that's on home canning basics is basically what this class is over. There is, on page 3, steps for successful boiling water canner, and we'll talk about that tonight. When we have the pressure canning class, we will review the steps for successful pressure canning. So I encourage you to either take this publication out or look at it on your computer, or just have pen and paper and take notes. Because when you take notes, you remember a little better. At least I do. Maybe you have a really good memory and you don't have to write it down, but I certainly do. So some other resources. So that's the University of Kentucky. The University of Georgia houses the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And you don't have to try to write that down. I'll email it to you. But the National Center for Home Food Preservation is at UGA, and they are essentially the hub of all things food preservation and all things of testing of food preservation. They are kind of like the extension agents. Well, they are our go-to resource for food preservation. All of the information in our publications that we have essentially come from them because they are doing the testing that I talk about. They are researching constantly methods and recipes and getting that out to the land-grant universities in each state in the country, and then passing the information on down for me to pass it on to you. So there is a book that they have called So Easy to Preserve, and this has lots of information, resources and methods and tips and troubleshooting in it as well. And if you wanted to buy one of these, you could, but they also have a wonderful website that has lots of resources. The videos that I'm going to be showing tonight come from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They have a multimedia section on there, and it has some videos on their YouTube channel. So check out that resource. You may know of the name Ball. If you have canned at all, you're probably familiar with Ball, and you might even be familiar with the Ball Blue book. It's no longer blue. It's a little different than when it first came out, and it was blue several years ago. But there are lots of resources in these booklets as well. Ball brand and Kerr brand are both owned by the same company, and the website is freshpreserving.com. Now, in Extension, we don't promote any product. We do not endorse any product. However, the reason why we endorse Ball and Kerr's recipes and methods is because we know that they are doing their own testing and their own research. So essentially, we have vetted them and say, yes, that, you know, they're the real deal. So they are a trusted resource as well. And there are lots of books. You can see they're pretty colorful. Lots of different recipes here. And one cool thing about their books too is that there are some pictures in here about how to and recipes that make you kind of drool because it looks so good. But really good resources there as well. And I wanted to just mention that if you have old publications, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is a publication from the University of Kentucky College of Ag in, where's the date down there? 1928. If you have a resource like this in your home, this is really cool, but this is a little outdated. There's information in here about open kettle canning and putting wax on your jams and jellies. This is completely outdated. So while this is really neat to have, don't follow the information in here. With that being said, though, as far as recipes in old publication like this, or if you have a recipe that your grandmother maybe made and has passed down, and she canned it, but it's just scribbled on, a piece of index paper. If you're not sure that that recipe is safe to can because it's not in one of these approved research-based sources, you can certainly send that recipe to me, and I can check with our specialist at the university, and they can look at the ingredients and the ratios and the processing time of that recipe to see if it's safe to use. So just a little bit there about resources. But I would also caution you that in this age of information, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of recipes out there, and there's a lot of recipes that aren't safe. So just be cautious when you're looking at recipes. If you're ever not sure about a source of recipes, just feel free to ask me. I am here as a resource. That's what I do, and I'll be glad to either answer your question or help you find out if it's a good resource. Okay, now we are going to go back to our PowerPoint here and talk a little bit about safety. And I know that when you see this slide, it's somebody washing their hands. And in this day of the COVID pandemic, we have heard about washing hands. How many times and how many seconds do you wash your hands? But again, going back to what I said in the beginning, when we think about canning, this wonderful food that is going to be shelf stable, we want to make sure that we're making the best product that we can that is the safest, okay? So in order for it to be safe, we want to be clean. So keep yourself clean when you're canning. When we're home cooking, okay, you might, especially if it's just you or your family, you might taste the soup, put your, mouth on the spoon and stir it again. That's okay if you're just doing that for you and your family. Well, I don't know if it's okay with your family, but for you, that's okay. But when we're canning, think about it the next step up. Think about it, how would you want somebody to cook your food in the back of the restaurant that you can't see? cook and can at that level when we're food processing, because we just want to make sure that everything is clean, sanitary, and safe. But really, that is the bottom line, is safety. Excuse me. And the biggest reason, and I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about botulism, is to prevent the growth of a little bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. And this isn't necessarily how he looks, but I can just imagine that what it does, that this is probably what it looks. So this is the bacteria, the spore that causes botulism. So Clostridium botulinum is the bacteria, botulism is the illness. So if we think about Clostridium botulinum growing in a jar, in a perfect environment for growth, you can't see it, and you can't smell it, and you can't taste it, and you can't boil it out. So when, again, just going back to, and I know I sound like a broken record, just making sure that we are using the safest, most research-based methods to prevent that. And so that's kind of our goal. Our goal is to do all these safe things to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum. And if that's the worst of the worst, well, we're also preventing all these other foodborne, bacteria to grow in our canned food, whether we can see it or not. So just remember, the safest of the safe to prevent this little guy from growing in there. Okay, so we are gonna stop the PowerPoint for just a minute, and I'm going to talk about some of the equipment that we use. So the first one is jars. So you want to make sure that you're using a mason type jar. And I mentioned the Ball and Kerr brands earlier. And while Ball certainly has a monopoly on canning products, Kerr and Golden Harvest are the other main brands that we hear of that are mason type jars. There are also some other jars on the market that are labeled as canning jars. They often are at big box stores and some other smaller stores. These jars are okay to use. They're not a name brand, they're just off brand, but it's a lesser quality jar. Okay, so it's safe to use, but you might see more of these jars break. You might have more of the seals not seal than if you use one of the other better quality brands. So just keep that in mind in the difference of the jars, but make sure that you are using a mason type jar. And you want to make sure that that you're using the appropriate jar and not a old mayonnaise or pickle jar like this, because these jars were manufactured and made to be used and gone through the heating process once. And of course, that's the commercial canning process. So these jars, if you kind of tap them side by side, you can kind of feel the difference. These jars, the used jars, the mayonnaise jars, are a little thinner, and they're not safe for a couple reasons, because there's more instances of jars breaking, the seals not sealing, and for the heat to not penetrate the jar as it should. So these jars, even though the lid will fit on top of some of them, they are not recommended to use for safety. For the jars, you want to make sure, and they can be used over and over and over. I don't think I said that. They're made to be canned and processed many, many, many times. As long as there's no nicks in the top or cracks or anything damaging the jar, you can use them over and over and over. And for the lids, you want to make sure that you have the 2-piece lids. Okay, that's what's recommended. There are the 1-piece lids, but those are not recommended for a couple reasons, mainly because there's issues with sealing properly. And then also, if you have the 1-piece lid, you can't take off the ring, and moisture can settle inside of the ring and cause rust, and we don't want that. So the 2-piece lids, we have the flat lid here, and this lid can only be used once. So once this lid has gone through the canning process and has been taken off of that jar, it's either garbage or make sure you know it's been used and reuse it for something else, which I do. I'll write on the top, of course, what it is and the date, and then I'll use this maybe for my dehydrated products in another jar or something else. So only use this once. Another thing about these lids, years ago, and actually not that many years ago, it was recommended to heat these lids in warm water. That is no longer recommended because the sealing compound that's around the lid is different. So when you put this lid on your clean jar and you put the screw band on, it will start to adhere to the jar. So you do not need to heat your flat lids as used to be recommended. The rings can be used over and over and over again, as long as there's no rust present. This one is very obviously rusty. This one might not be so obviously rusty, but this one also has a dent, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's dented in right here. So as long as these aren't rusty or dented, they can be used over and over and over again. Check my notes here, make sure sometimes I get ahead of myself and I just start talking. So like this lid has something written on it, so I know I'm not going to use this one again. Okay, so some tools and utensils that we use. And if you were one of the lucky ones that signed up early and got the canning kit, you received one of each of these three little tools. So the first one is a funnel, and this is it's a little bit bigger funnel than normal, and it's just for filling whatever you're canning in your jar. And this comes in handy too, even if you're not canning something liquid. So let's say salsa. This comes in really handy for putting your salsa in there because it's pretty liquidy. But if you're canning something like let's say meat. So with meat, let's say I was doing raw pack, it's chunks and I'm putting it in there. It's really easy just to put that in the jar. But this also helps to keep the rim of the jar clean. So it's kind of two-purpose. It helps you get stuff in the jar, but it also helps to keep your jar rim clean. So kind of dual purpose there. And then we have our jar lifter. And as the name alludes to, it is for lifting jars. And if you've not used one of these before, the black part at the top here is the handle. A lot of people tend to want to grab this part, which makes sense. It's kind of grippy, but the black part is the handle and the grippy part is what grabs a hold of the jar. And there's different types of these. They have spring-loaded ones, lots of different fancy ones. I prefer this simple one. It's not bulky and it's really easy to use. And then we have another tool, really two tools in one. It is a headspace tool on this end and a bubble remover on this end. And we will talk a little more about removing bubbles and headspace, but it is essentially, you put the stair steps right in the jar and you can see exactly what your headspace needs to be. Again, we'll talk about that. So those are a few of the tools that we use. And then some of the ingredients. So we have salt is an ingredient, and you want to make sure to use canning and pickling salt, or it's called different. Sometimes it's just canning salt, sometimes it's just pickling salt. But canning and or pickling salt is what you want to use. It doesn't have iodine in it, so you don't want to use table salt because that can cause cloudiness in your jar, and there's also bacteria that can cause cloudiness. So why have any question in it? Take that out, and again, best of the best methods, use the canning salt. Vinegar is another ingredient that we use in canning. And you want to make sure that whatever kind of vinegar you're using, that you don't change it in the recipe. So if it calls for white vinegar, use white vinegar. If it calls for apple cider vinegar, use apple cider vinegar. Don't interchange those unless the recipe says. There are a lot of recipes that will say white vinegar or apple cider, and you can choose. But whatever vinegar you're using, you want to make sure that on the label, I'm going to try to get this real close so you can see it. There it is. Do you see how it says reduced with water to 5% acidity? So you want to make sure that your vinegar, again, no matter if it's white or apple cider, that it has somewhere on the label, might not focus, diluted with water to 5% acid strength. So sometimes the wording is a little different, but somewhere on that vinegar, you want to make sure it says 5% acid or 5% acid strength. You don't want to dilute it. You don't want to use your own, and I don't think that you can make vinegar stronger, but you want to use just the commercial vinegar. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit now about the acid in food, low acid versus high acid. And we have a little video that we are going to play, but essentially, when we're talking about boiling water canning, all those foods that I mentioned earlier, fruits, tomatoes, salsas, pickles, those foods are high acid, which is a low pH, which is kind of confusing, but this isn't a science test. But any foods that have a high acid content can safely be canned in the boiling water canner. So the video that we're going to show is just going to talk a little more about that.
A food's acid content, or pH, determines how it should be processed. Generally, most fruits, pickles, and soft spreads are classified as acid foods. Acid foods can be processed in a boiling water canner. Some fruits, such as tomatoes, figs, and Asian pears, require the addition of an acid so they can be safely processed in a boiling water canner. Vegetables, meat, poultry, and seafood are low acid foods. Low acid foods require canning at higher temperatures than can be achieved in a boiling water canner. This requires a pressure canner.
All right. So what I want to talk about now is the actual canners. And we're going to go, after we talk about this, we're going to go through the steps of this is how you can. But let's talk about the canners first. So a lot of times when we think about boiling water canning, you think of a canner that looks something like this. But the cool thing about boiling water canning is that any pot can be a boiling water canner as long as it meets a few requirements. So it has to be tall enough to not only fit your jar in, but also to be able to fill the canner up with water 1 to 2 inches above that jar. Okay, so it has to be that tall. So if you're doing quarts, you know, your pot needs to be about that tall. Well, you can't see that, but about that tall. It also has to be tall enough to have water completely cover the top. It has to have a rack in the bottom of some sort, and it has to have a lid. It doesn't necessarily have to have a lid, but it sure helps to have a lid, keeps that heat in. So if you bought a canner that looked like this, it would come with a rack that looks like this, okay? And that just goes right in the bottom. But there's other canners too, and this looks like a big pot, and really, technically, it is a big pot. This one is nice though because it has a clear lid, so I can see exactly what's happening in my canner. It also has a rack inside and an instruction manual. Whoops, I just tossed that. But you want to keep your instruction manual. So you see, this is, you know, there's nothing too fancy to this, really, to either of these. It's just a pot with a tall pot with a rack. So as long as you have a pot that meets those requirements, it could be a boiling water canner. You could even use a pressure canner as a boiling water canner without the gasket and the lid on top. So just to keep that in mind. You do want to make sure that your canner, you know, it doesn't have any dents or really bad scratches, because canners like this tend to get little scratches and rust a little bit. So just make sure that it's in good working order. You want to make sure that you have the rack too, so that your jar is not sitting directly on the bottom of the canner, because if it's directly on the bottom of the canner, it is that much closer to the heat source and it can cause the jars to break. So make sure that you have that rack. Okay, so now we are going to go through these steps of boiling water canning, and you can refer to, scooch this down a little bit, that publication that I mentioned in the beginning, the Home Canning Basics, on page 3. So the steps for successfully boiling water canning. So the first step, of course, is to get everything together, make sure you have everything, all your utensils even. You're going to wash your jars. And when you wash your jars, you want to be sure that they are, that they're either, well, okay, let me back up. If your processing time for your recipe is under 10 minutes, you want to sterilize these jars for at least 10 minutes in boiling water. So that can just be the water in your canner. You can put these jars down in there for 10 minutes and sterilize them. I say that, but you probably won't ever have to do that because most recipes, minimum time is 10 minutes. I don't know that I've ever seen a recipe that's 5 minutes or even 8 minutes. Typically minimum time is 10 minutes, but just something to keep in mind. But you want to wash your jars, and you want to be sure to wash, where did that ring go that I dropped? You want to be sure to wash, of course, your jars, your lids, but also your screw band. A lot of people don't think to wash the screw band because the food never touches it, but you want to make sure that this is clean as well. So make sure that that is all washed and clean, ready to go, along with your utensils and your canner. That's another step that a lot of people don't think about, washing the actual canner. After you use a canner over and over, it gets a little dirty. You know, even though food's not in there, there's water in there, and you know, maybe you dropped some food in there. Just make sure that all your equipment that you're using is clean. So the first step in boiling water canning is to fill your canner about half full, depending on the size of your jar. If you're using the little small jelly jars that are 4 ounces, I believe, you're not going to need that much water because those are really short jars. But if you're canning quarts, you're going to need more water. But you don't want to fill it too high either, because it's no fun taking, after you get your jars in there and you think, oh no, it's going to overflow. If it's getting that high, just imagine what it's going to be like when it's boiling. It might be coming out, and that could be dangerous. So one thing that you can do to prevent, you know, not having enough water in there, or having to take it out, have a tea kettle or a pot over on the side on a burner that is just boiling water. So if you see that you don't have enough water in here after you get your jars in, you can add some, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But just, you know, especially if you're doing quarts, definitely halfway. Maybe pints a little less. It's easier to add though than add water than it is to take out. Trust me on that. I have that experience. There's an optional step here. After we've filled our canner with water, you can add some white vinegar just directly in the water. And that will prevent, if you can see this, it's not a food safety issue. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but if you can see, this jar is kind of iridescent as compared to this jar. And the reason for that is the mineral buildup in the water. And that just causes that little bit of iridescent from the mineral in the water. So you can just add a little bit of vinegar, maybe just a tablespoon. There's no exact science to that. Just, you know, maybe a little whoop in the water. That will prevent that. So after you have your water in here, you put a little vinegar in if you want. You lower your rack, have that ready, and you'll start to heat your water. Now you don't want your water to be boiling yet. You just want your water to get warm. You don't want to put your jars into cold water. You just want it to be nice and warm. And there is a recommendation of 180 degrees, you know, if you wanted to check that water, but just as long as it's pretty warm, but you don't want it to be boiling. At that time, and make sure to put your lid on, because if you're boiling water, of course, You have your lid on and it will keep that heat in. So then you're going to prepare whatever your recipe is. And it might depend on your recipe. Like if you're doing pickles and it's a long process, you might start that before you fill your canner and turn your water on. But we have our water heating. We have our recipe ready. We are going to fill our jars. So we are going to use our funnel and we're going to fill the jars. We're not going to get into the specifics of the recipes because that's what some of the other classes are for, and we'll talk specifically about that. But in your recipe, it will tell you, if it's an approved recipe, that's actually a good thing to look for, is the headspace. The recipe should say, fill your jars to X amount of headspace. And it will be usually a fourth, a quarter, a half, or 1 inch. And that is where this tool comes in handy. So if I'm doing tomatoes or pickles, the headspace is 1/2 inch. And I know you aren't going to be able to see it on camera, but the stair steps there's a little indentation there that says 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 of an inch. So if I'm doing tomatoes, I know my headspace is 1/2 inch because that's what my recipe says. So I'm going to put my headspace tool in and I'm going to fill my jar to where the food is just touching the bottom of this headspace tool. Okay. And what I think is easiest is, let's say we're doing salsa. I guess that's my example because I have a jar of it here tonight. And I'll ladle my salsa in with my funnel up to about that rim. I'll go to the next jar, fill it up to the bottom rim, do that all over. And then I will come back. I will use the other end of this tool to go down in the jar and to remove the air bubbles. I'm going to do that first before I adjust my headspace to what is correct. So if there's any bubbles down in the food, I'm going to move this around so the bubbles can release, because if there's bubbles in the food and it comes up, then the level of the food is going to drop down just a little bit. You probably won't notice, but it does, and it's important to know that. So then I'm going to turn it around and look at my headspace, and I'm going to have a smaller spoon and adjust it right underneath that headspace tool. So at that point, once all of my jars are full and the headspace is correct, then I'm going to wipe the rim of my jar. Okay, I want to make sure that this is clean, clean, clean before I put my lid on. Okay, and one thing to note too, the headspace tool is plastic, as are the other utensils. You want to make sure you're not putting any metal down inside the jar. I can remember my grandmother, when she was canning, she had like a special canning butter knife, of course metal, that she would use, and she knew that she needed to get the air bubbles out, but she would take that knife and man, she would go to town getting those air bubbles out. There's a couple reasons why that's potentially concerning. One, metal on glass could chip the glass. Okay, that's not safe, obviously, when we're talking about it in food. And the metal can also have a reaction with the food that's in the jar and could potentially contaminate it. So we just want to make sure that we're using plastic inside our jars. So at that time, we are going to wipe the rim of the jar, clean, clean. Our lid is clean, clean.
Question.
You have a question? Go ahead.
Somebody says they always use the headspace size, I think, to pop the bubbles. Does it make a difference?
Oh, does it make a difference? Okay, somebody was saying they use the headspace size to go in and just release the bubbles. No, that doesn't make a difference. And I actually do that at home. So it's easier, I think, to keep one end messy than flip it around. So yeah, you can certainly just stir it around with the headspace end. Good question. Those are the kind of little tips and things that is not written down in this publication, and like the vinegar, adding it to the water, but those are the little tips that help us. So we're gonna put our lid on our jar, our clean jar rim, and then we're gonna put the screw band on. Now, when we put the screw band on, you want to just tighten it finger tight. I'm not going to clamp this down. It doesn't need to be clamped down. And actually, it could be bad if it's clamped down too much, because the rim of the jar could potentially start to cut into this plastisol. And if it pushes in too tightly, it might not create a seal. and the air might escape. So just fingertip tight, just to where you're, closing a jar, nothing fancy. And at that point, once we have all of our jars closed in, then we'll put them in the canner. But we have another quick video to show about headspace in our jars when we're talking about the headspace tool. And like I mentioned earlier, these videos are on the National Center for Home Food Preservation website that I'll send you. Oh, this is full screen.
Headspace is completely empty space left in the jar between the inside of the lid and the top of the food or liquid. As a general rule, leave 1 inch of headspace for low-acid foods, vegetables, and meats. 1/2 inch headspace for high-acid foods, fruits, and tomatoes. And 1/4 inch headspace for juices, jams, and jellies. Headspace is important in maintaining food quality and helps lids to seal properly.
Okay, and that's another thing that, when we talk about the methods and the recipes, so the recipe will have the headspace in it, and that's another thing that you want to make sure to follow the recipe and don't alter that. And you might think, well, I would never alter the headspace, but if you were canning grape jelly, for example, and you filled your jars and you had one jar that only filled, let's say 1/2 inch instead of 1/4 inch headspace at the top. And you think, well, that's close enough. Well, it's not quite close enough because the airspace at the top, that empty space, is important for the product that's in the jar, the processing time. It's not something to mess around with, the headspace or any of the methods in the recipe or any of the recommendations, in the recipe. So if that were to happen, and you have not quite enough to fill a jar, what I would typically do, especially if it's jam or jelly or something like that that really does need to process, I would go ahead before I put it on my canner, mark on it, not correct headspace, or put an X on it or something so you know. So then when you process it and take it out, you know that jar needs to go in the refrigerator. After it cools a little bit, of course. Don't put it in there boiling hot, but that jar is not going to be safe at room temperature. So processing. There's 2 methods for processing, raw pack and hot pack. And I think, let's see, we can go ahead and put this back. Yeah, we can go ahead and put this back up on the PowerPoint. And your recipe will tell you, sometimes recipes will give you an option. Sometimes recipes don't give you an option, but raw pack is essentially where you're putting the raw product in the jar and either adding liquid or whatever it might be, and then processing it. Hot pack is where you are blanching, cooking for just a short amount of time that food, and then putting it in the jar and then canning it. Mostly hot pack and raw pack comes into play with pressure canning, but there's benefits and pros and cons to both. So with raw pack, the benefit is you don't have to cook the food product that's going in the jar, you just put it in the jar. The downside, though, is that you don't fit as much in the jar. And I know we're talking about boiling water canning, but I always like to use green beans as an example. So green beans do have to be canned in the pressure canner, but I've canned those side by side, hot pack and raw pack. And you can see that the raw pack, you do not fit as many beans if you don't cook them as if you do cook them. So the hot pack is just that. You're cooking that food for a short amount of time and then putting it in the jar, and you're able to fit more of that food in the jar. And it also removes more air. So if you are raw packing a food, you will probably see that after you take that jar out of the canner, that you may have lost a little bit of liquid out of the top of that jar. which is not necessarily a concern, but that could happen. So the con of hot pack though is that it takes a little extra time to cook that food, and it's also another burner on your stove that you're using. And in the summertime, that heats up your kitchen a little more. So it's pros and cons. There's definitely probably more benefit to the hot pack, but if the recipe gives you an option, it's really up to you, whichever one you prefer. Okay, so at this point, we are loading our canner. Okay, our jars are full of our food, and we are loading them in, of course, with our jar lifter. And when you load your jars in, you want to make sure to keep them upright. So you don't want to tilt them or splash it around. You want to try to prevent any food from getting on the bottom of the lid. So we're going to keep them upright and just load them in here. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a puzzle to move them around and adjust them so that they all fit in there. But have those in there. Once you get your canner loaded, you want to make sure, remember when I was talking earlier about what can be a boiling water canner. So one of those 3 requirements is that water has to be 1 to 2 inches above your jars or more. More water is better. So when your jar is in your canner like that, what I like to do is use my headspace tool and just go in and tap the edge of the jar, pull this up, and I can easily see this is 1 inch. So it needs to be above that, 1.5 to 2 inches, and I can see if I have enough water in there. If I don't, then this is the time when I would reach for my boiling water on the back burner, and I would pour boiling water in my canner to make sure that my water level was 1 to 2 inches above my jars. When you do that, you want to make sure that the water is being poured in between the jars and not directly on top of one of the jars, because it could, if your water is not boiling, it's not hot, it is hot, but it's not that hot. The boiling water on top of your jar on the lid could cause the lid to buckle or something to happen with the seal. So make sure that it goes in between the jars. Okay, so we have all our jars in here. They're all full. We have our water level appropriate. We are going to put our lid on, and we are going to turn our burner on high. So what is going to happen? Our water is going to boil, of course. We're going to wait and watch it. Actually, don't watch it because a watch pot never boils. So once it is boiling, that is when you will start your processing time. So your recipe will say process in a boiling water canner for, let's just say 20 minutes. Okay, so my water is boiling and I've started my timer, 20 minutes. Okay, we're going to go through the processing time. Once the timer goes off, ding, 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 then I am going to remove the lid and turn the burner off. And I'm just going to kind of let it chill out here for 5 minutes. That is to let it cool down just a little bit. Of course, it's still going to be really hot, but going from boiling water to 212 degrees to cooling it down to maybe 180 or so, that's an important step in the cooling process. We don't want to cool it down too fast. We also don't want to cool it down too slow, but that helps just bring it down just a little bit before we take it out of that really hot water into the cool air. Even if the air is hot in your kitchen, it's still cooler than what the water is. So after that 5 minutes is over, we're going to reach down in our canner and take our jar out. And again, when you're removing your jars, you want to make sure that you keep them upright. And it's harder to do that when you're taking them out of the boiling water canner. And I'll tell you why. Because there's a little bit of water, of course, that is on top of this lid. And I really want to get that water off, but I know that I am not supposed to tilt my jars because it could compromise the seal. So don't tilt that water off. Make sure to keep it just upright. Take them out of the canner, and then you'll set your jars on a towel or a wooden cutting board, something that is not going to be cold. For example, I would not set my jars directly on this metal countertop that we have because it's very cold. If you have granite or a natural marble, that can also be a little too cold, too drastic for that canning jar. So you could put a towel down and set your jars on the towel. Speaking of towel, something that I guess a lot of people used to do this, but I think some people still do it, is lay a towel over top of all your nicely canned jars. And I would recommend you to not do that because that is basically going to act as a little bit of an insulator. And those very hot jars that need to now cool down will stay very hot. And when they stay very hot, they're getting into that danger zone, if you've ever heard that. That's the 40 to 140 degree temperature. So that's room temperature is right in there. And a little warmer than room temperature. So we don't want them to stay hot. We want them to cool down. We want them to cool down slowly though. So you want to make sure too that you don't have a fan blowing on them or the air conditioner vent hitting them. You want them to cool down naturally. And make sure too to space them out, okay, when you set them out, a couple inches so that the air can flow through all of your finished jars. Okay, at that point, then you wait. And you should hear that music. You should hear that popping noise, knowing that they seal. And when they do seal, you might be tempted to go over and touch it and see, oh, did it really seal? But don't do that. Don't touch them. You can look at them and ooh and ah at them, but don't touch them or don't tighten the screw band. Sometimes the screw band loosens up a little bit in canning. Don't tighten it though. It's fine just the way that it is. Just let them sit for at least 12 hours and then no more than 24. So between 12 and 24 hours, you want to check your jars to make sure that they have all sealed. And that's when you can go through and tap the top and feel that they're sealed. Now, if you're going through tapping the top and one of the jars doesn't seal, so of course it would sound kind of like that. I have had instances before where a jar didn't seal, but when I came through and pressed and that button went down, it stayed down. Now, that is not a vacuum seal. I don't think that happens often, but that has happened before where the button stays down. If that happens, pull that jar away and set it aside and maybe even, put an X on it because that jar is not going to be stable at room temperature. You can, however, if that happens and maybe you have a jar that didn't seal, you can reprocess it. And that's why we say between 12 to 24 hours. Before 24 hours, you can reprocess that jar. And I think that's only worth it if you have several that don't seal, or if you're going to be doing the same batch again, at that same time, you can just add that jar in. If that happens and you have a jar that doesn't seal, you will need to start over and use a new flat lid, because technically this lid has already been used. It has gone through the canning process and it has been cooled. So this lid needs to be thrown away and use a new one. So you would start over, wipe the rim, add the lid, and just add it to your next jars or reprocess it. And of course, you want to make sure to label it with what it is and the date, because you won't remember. Trust me, you won't remember. And anything that is home canned, we recommend to use within about 2 years for best quality. Now, if you've canned appropriately, of course, and used all the proper equipment and correct methods and a research-based recipe, it can last for longer than that. But after that time, the quality of the product is going to go down. So we like to say, can what you are going to eat within about the next year or so to get the best quality, because within that year, you're going to get the best quality of whatever it is that you've canned. But about 2 years is a good guideline. And then you can store your jars in a cool, dark place. And another thing, when you store your jars, it's a good idea to remove the screw band. The only purpose of the screw band is to hold the lid on while it's processing and cooling. So at this point, when my jar has sealed, it's cooled, I've labeled it, put the date on it, I can take the screw band off and store it. You might though, before you store it and you take the screw band off, is to wipe the rim. Sometimes it can get a little moisture under there. You just want to make sure that there is no moisture before you store it, because obviously moisture and metal creates rust. Okay, so we have one other video to show you, and it's just kind of an overview of the boiling water canning process. And then we will wrap up here.
Somebody did ask, is it okay to add fresh herbs to jams and jellies and tomatoes? Does that change the processing time?
Good question about that. So it is okay to add herbs to jams and jellies or even other canned foods, as long as it is a low enough ratio. And off the top of my head, I don't know what that ratio is. Whoever asked that question, if you are interested in, or actually what I'll do, just for purposes of everybody on this call, I will find the answer to that question and I will include that in the email that I send out, or the specifics of how much, what the ratio is for fresh herbs.
Okay, and then they said storing, also not to stack them when you're storing, is that correct?
When you're storing your jars, yes, that is correct. Now you can stack like 2 boxes for, and if you have bought new jars in the nice cardboard box, those are really handy to keep after you have canned, and then fill those boxes back up with the full jars. You can stack those, maybe a couple together, but you don't want to stack them too high because of the weight and anything else on top of them for that matter. Yeah, that's a good question.
And my grandmother used to store them upside down. Is that a bad thing to do?
Oh, that's interesting. She said that her grandmother used to store them upside down. The reason that she probably did that, and maybe she mostly did that with jams and jellies, because that used to be a common practice. You would fill your jar with jam or jelly, and then you would turn it upside down to seal. There was no processing, you would turn it upside down to seal. So no, there's no need to store them upside down. I don't think that would hurt anything, but it's not necessary. And I guess maybe a reason why you wouldn't want to store them upside down is if for some reason your lid came unsealed and the product oozed out, or the weight on the lid, I wouldn't say that would be a good idea to store it upside down.
I just says I was told not to stack them at all in case the seal breaks, and I want to be able to tell if they were good or not. So I wonder if it's just on jar on top of jar instead of like box on box.
Well, I mean, stacking it all, if you have the space to spread them out, that would be great. But, just the weight of one jar on top of the other jar isn't going to affect the seal. Any other questions in there?
Yeah, we're all caught up.
Okay, all right.
Video time.
Yeah, video time, movie time.
Wait.
Oh, it's right underneath there.
During the boiling water canning process, heat is transferred into the liquid and food in the jars by the boiling water. Place the rack in the bottom of the canner. Don't let the jars touch the bottom of the canner. Fill the canner at least 1/2 full, depending on how many jars you will be processing. For fewer jars, you'll need more water. Bring the water to a simmer, or 180 degrees Fahrenheit for hot packed foods, or to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for raw packed foods. The water should not be boiling. After jars are filled and rings adjusted, use a jar lifter to place jars onto the canning rack. Keep jars upright at all times. Space the jars evenly around the inside of the canner. Add or remove hot water to place water level at 1 to 2 inches above the jars. If more hot water is needed, pour the water around the jars, not on them. Turn your burner to the highest setting. Cover the canner. Start your timer when the water reaches a rolling boil. The water should never stop boiling during the processing time. Keep the water level and temperature constant. Have a small pot of extra boiling water handy. If more water is needed during the process, add it around the jars, not directly on top of them. Process for the full time required by the recipe. At the end of the process time, turn off the heat and take the lid off the canner. Tilting it away from your face to prevent steam burns. Wait 5 minutes.
So that's just kind of an overview, an action shot of what we talked about. And two things that I wanted to mention as I watched the video. If you are only canning a few jars, what you can do is take an empty jar, fill it with water, no lid or anything on it, and put that down in your canner. So if I only had, let's say 1 jar of salsa, I could surround that 1 jar with just empty jars, no lid, with water, and that will help it so that it doesn't move around. Because in the boiling water canner, you can imagine that, with the boiling water, all that action going on in there, the jars, they kind of move around just a little bit. So the empty jars will help to stabilize the few jars that you do have. And then the second piece is, and this is a very important piece, so make note of this. And I didn't realize that I missed it out until the video, but if at any point in time your water stops boiling, okay, we have our jars in here, our water is boiling, we've started our timer for 20 minutes, and let's say we get to 10 minutes and we look in there and we realize, oh no, somebody accidentally hit the knob on the burner and the water quit boiling. What you have to do is heat that water back up and start your time over. So once it gets to boiling again, you'll have to start your 20 minutes or however long your recipe says to process for, start that time over. So it is not that may affect the quality because it's been in the canner for longer than it needed to be, but your food is going to be safe if you do that. So a couple things there that I failed to mention earlier.
Is it okay to add it when it's already boiling?
Good question. So is it okay to add the jars when it's already boiling? No, that's not recommended. And a couple reasons. The main one is it could break the jar. So even if you have a jar here that has a hot product in it and you are lifting it up and putting it into this very hot water, that difference of temperature could cause the jar to break, and it's just too hot too fast. So I remember when I was talking about cooling it down from boiling to not boiling, when we are ready to take our jars out, it's the same as when we're putting it in the canner. We want to go from room temperature to really hot and then boiling. Okay, so we're going to take it up those steps and then take it down those steps to cool it.
Then does your processing time start when you put it in the water or when the water starts boiling?
So that's, if you remember earlier when we were talking about that. So once we have everything in here, okay, our jars are all filled and ready to go, we add the lid, wait for it to boil, and then start your time. So a good way to remember processing time, in boiling water canning, you start your time when the water is boiling. In pressure canning, you start your time when you've reached the right pressure, okay? So good question to clarify that. You start your time when the water's boiling. Any other questions on there? All right, well, if you do have any more questions, everybody has my contact information because you got an email from me. Feel free to reach out to me, whether or not you live here in Woodford County. You can contact me at the Woodford County Extension Office, but you can also contact your county extension agent in your county as well. We are here to help. We are not here to say you have to do this, but like I said in the beginning, we just want you to know the safest way, not only to have a safe home canned product, but to have the best quality home canned product. Because like I said, it takes a little little bit of energy and time and knowledge to go through all this process. So I want to make sure that this is safe